I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're folding laundry, wiping down a counter, or coming home from a long day at work, watching the clock tick and feeling invisible. Rosa Martinez had spent 23 years making herself invisible. The cruelest part wasn't the silence. It was the way people looked right through her, as if her calloused hands and weathered face were nothing more than moving furniture. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding clothes, or heading home after a long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise. Today's story will surprise you. In the gleaming heart of San Francisco's Pacific Heights neighborhood, where Victorian mansions perched like crowned jewels against the rolling hills, the morning fog rolled in from the bay like a gray velvet curtain. Behind towering iron gates that cost more than most people's annual salaries, the Ware Mansion stood as a monument to both success and sorrow. Its windows, each one worth thousands of dollars, reflected nothing but emptiness. Jonathan Ware, heir to a fortune built on real estate investments and tech stocks, stood at his office window watching his net worth climb on multiple screens. Millions in traditional assets, cryptocurrency portfolios worth more than small countries' GDP, dividend payments flowing in like digital waterfalls. Yet, for all his wealth, for all the zeros in his bank accounts and the properties scattered across 3 continents, he couldn't buy back the sound of his wife's laughter echoing through these marble halls. Sarah had died 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago. Jonathan counted every sunrise without her, each one a reminder that his billions couldn't purchase another moment with the only person who had ever made this fortress feel like home. The cancer had taken her slowly, cruelly, despite the best doctors money could secure, despite experimental treatments that cost more than luxury apartments. In those final weeks, she had whispered to him about hiring someone kind to keep the house warm after she was gone. "Promise me," she had said, her voice barely audible above the machines monitoring her failing body. "Promise me, you won't let this place die with me." But kindness, Jonathan had learned, was not something you could interview for or find listed on employment websites. It certainly wasn't something he trusted easily, not anymore. The previous housekeeper had lasted exactly 8 months before disappearing one Tuesday morning, leaving behind only a note claiming she couldn't work in a house that felt haunted by grief. The butler, Mr. Harrison, had recommended several agencies, each promising discreet professional staff for high-net-worth clients. They spoke in terms of background checks, reference letters, and insurance coverage, all the paperwork that money demanded, but none of the humanity Sarah had dreamed of. The mansion, worth $18 million according to the latest property assessment, had become a showcase of dust-covered perfection, where even the fresh flowers delivered weekly seemed to wilt faster than they should. Rosa Martinez began her day at 4:30 in the morning in a studio apartment on Eddy Street, in the heart of San Francisco's Tenderloin district. The building, a century-old structure that creaked with every footstep and sighed with every gust of Pacific wind, housed dozens of stories like hers. Immigrants, working mothers, elderly people living on fixed incomes, all dreaming of something better while making do with something real. Her apartment, barely 400 square feet, was a masterpiece of careful organization. Every dish had its place. Every photograph was positioned to catch the morning light. Every corner held some small beauty she had rescued from thrift stores or found abandoned on sidewalks. The contrast between her world and the world she was about to enter couldn't have been starker, yet Rosa had learned long ago that dignity wasn't measured in square footage or asset allocation. She stood before her bathroom mirror, the glass cracked in one corner from where her late husband Miguel had accidentally dropped a bottle of aftershave 3 years ago. She kept meaning to replace it but found comfort in that small imperfection, a reminder that some things were worth preserving even when broken. Her reflection showed a woman of 57, with silver threading through hair she still wore long and braided down her back. Her hands, marked by years of cleaning other people's homes, scrubbing floors that cost more per square foot than she earned in a month, told stories of resilience. Each callus was evidence of survival, each line a testament to the countless hours spent making other families' lives more comfortable while her own grew smaller and quieter. The bus ride from Tenderloin to Pacific Heights, took 43 minutes on a good day, longer when the fog was thick enough to slow traffic to a crawl. Rosa had memorized every stop, every turn, every view of the bay that appeared and disappeared between buildings like fleeting promises. She carried her lunch in a paper bag. Always the same sandwich, always wrapped in wax paper, always accompanied by an apple and a thermos of coffee that had to last the entire day. Around her, the city woke up in layers. First, the service workers like herself, heading to clean offices and cook meals and care for children who weren't their own. Then the commuters with their lattes and smartphones, already checking stock prices and cryptocurrency portfolios. Finally, the wealthy who emerged from their mansions and penthouses like royalty greeting their subjects. As the bus climbed higher into Pacific Heights, Rosa watched the neighborhoods transform. The crack houses and check-cashing stores of Tenderloin gave way to boutique cafes and art galleries, then to the pristine sidewalks and manicured gardens of the truly wealthy. Here even the trash cans were elegant, and the fire hydrants looked like they had been polished by hand. Rosa had worked in this neighborhood for 15 years, moving from house to house as families relocated or decided they needed a change in service. She had learned to read the architecture of wealth. The wider the driveway, the more careful she needed to be. The more expensive the art on the walls, the less likely she was to be noticed as anything more than a necessary function. The Ware mansion announced itself with understatement that only the truly wealthy could afford. No ostentatious displays, no golden fixtures or marble lions, just perfect proportions, impeccable maintenance, and the kind of quiet grandeur that whispered rather than shouted. The iron gates, operated by a security system worth more than Rosa's annual salary, swung open silently as she approached. Mr. Harrison, the head butler, waited at the front door with the expression of a man perpetually disappointed by life's failure to meet his standards. He was tall, pale, and thin, in the way that suggested he had spent decades perfecting the art of looking down on people, literally and figuratively. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, pronouncing her name with the careful precision of someone handling something distasteful, but necessary. "Mr. Ware will see you briefly before you begin. I trust you understand the importance of discretion in a household of this caliber." Rosa nodded, her hands folded in front of her, her posture straight despite the weight of exhaustion she carried from her previous job cleaning office buildings until midnight. She had learned that the wealthy required deference, but not servility, presence, but not personality. It was a delicate balance, one that many workers never mastered, which explained the constant turnover in houses like this. Jonathan's home office occupied what had once been the mansion's formal library, its walls lined with first-edition books that probably contained more value than most people's investment portfolios. He sat behind a desk crafted from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood, its surface covered with 3 monitors displaying real-time market data, cryptocurrency charts, and property valuations from around the world. When Rosa entered, escorted by Mr. Harrison's disapproving presence, Jonathan barely glanced up from a report detailing his latest acquisition, a portfolio of rental properties in Austin that would generate passive income of $40,000 per month. "Mrs. Martinez," he said without looking at her, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man conducting routine business. "The position requires absolute reliability, complete discretion, and attention to detail that borders on perfection. The salary is competitive for the market, with performance reviews every 6 months that will determine continuation of employment." He finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and Rosa saw something that made her heart contract with unexpected sympathy. Behind the practiced coldness, behind the barriers of wealth and grief, she glimpsed a man so lost that all his millions couldn't purchase a map back to himself. "I understand, Mr. Ware," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "I've been doing this work for 15 years. I know how to take care of a home." Something in her tone, not subservient, not eager to please, just quietly confident, made Jonathan pause. He had expected the usual litany of promises and assurances that accompanied most job interviews. Instead, Rosa stood there with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided she was capable of the work, regardless of his opinion. It was refreshing and somehow unsettling. He waved his hand dismissively, already returning his attention to the screens full of numbers that made sense to him in ways people never did. The tour of the mansion that followed was a journey through perfectly preserved emptiness. 23 rooms, each one decorated by professionals who charged more per hour than Rosa earned in a week, each one feeling like a museum exhibit rather than a living space. The kitchen alone, with its imported Italian marble countertops and appliances that cost more than luxury cars, could have housed Rosa's entire apartment twice over. Yet it felt cold, unused, like a stage set waiting for actors who would never arrive. Mr. Harrison narrated the tour with the enthusiasm of a funeral director, pointing out priceless antiques and artwork while emphasizing the catastrophic consequences of any damage, any oversight, any failure to maintain the pristine order that money demanded. The other staff members Rosa encountered during her first day treated her with the particular brand of contempt that service workers often reserved for their newest colleagues. Mrs. Patterson, the head cook who had probably never cooked for anyone earning less than 7 figures, sniffed audibly when Rosa asked about meal schedules. Thomas, the chauffeur who maintained a collection of vehicles worth more than most people's houses, barely acknowledged her presence. Even Maria, the part-time gardener who tended to flower beds that required monthly investments equivalent to Rosa's rent, seemed to view her as competition rather than a colleague. In the hierarchy of service, Rosa quickly realized she occupied the lowest rung, the new arrival, the unknown quantity, the one most likely to disappear when the pressure became too much. But pressure was something Rosa had learned to withstand long before she ever stepped foot in Pacific Heights. She had survived Miguel's death in a construction accident that left her with funeral bills and no life insurance. She had endured the humiliation of applying for food stamps while working 3 jobs, the shame of choosing between rent and medication, the exhaustion of commuting 2 hours each way to clean office buildings for minimum wage. She had raised 2 children in a neighborhood where gunshots were more common than police sirens, where hope was rationed like water in a drought. These marble floors and crystal chandeliers didn't intimidate her. They were simply another kind of surface to clean, another kind of beauty to preserve. Her first weeks in the Ware mansion followed a routine as precise as the grandfather clock that chimed every hour in the main foyer. Rosa arrived each morning at 7, armed with supplies she purchased herself because the household budget apparently didn't account for the preferences of actual workers. She cleaned methodically, room by room, learning the mansion's quirks and secrets, which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck, which furniture pieces were antiques worth more than cars, and which were simply expensive reproductions. She moved through the space like a whisper, her presence noted but not acknowledged, essential but invisible. Jonathan's daily schedule rarely varied. Morning coffee in his office, taken black and consumed while studying market reports. Lunch, if he remembered to eat, consisted of whatever Mrs. Patterson prepared and abandoned in the kitchen. Afternoons were spent on conference calls with investment advisors, real estate brokers, and lawyers managing the complex web of trusts and holdings that protected his wealth. Evenings found him in the library, surrounded by books he never read, nursing glasses of whiskey that cost more per bottle than Rosa earned in a month. He moved through his own home like a ghost, haunting a place he couldn't quite remember how to leave. Rosa noticed details that others missed, because noticing was how she had survived. She saw the photographs hidden in desk drawers, glimpses of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile who had loved this man before grief turned him to stone. She observed the way he unconsciously touched his wedding ring during phone calls, the way he avoided the master bedroom entirely, sleeping instead in a guest room that felt more like a hotel suite than a place of rest. She witnessed the careful way he arranged fresh flowers in the foyer every Tuesday, not because he enjoyed them, but because Tuesday had been Sarah's favorite day, and the flowers were white roses, which had been Sarah's favorite blooms. These small rituals of remembrance spoke of a love so deep that losing it had required him to build walls tall enough to keep out everything else, including the possibility of healing. The mansion's other inhabitants existed on the periphery of Jonathan's grief, employees who performed their functions without attempting to penetrate the fortress he had constructed around his heart. But Rosa, perhaps because she understood the weight of loss, perhaps because her own survival had required her to see past surfaces to the humanity beneath, found herself moved by the elaborate loneliness that money had purchased for him. She began to leave small signs of her presence. Not intrusions exactly, but gentle acknowledgments that someone else had been there. A window opened to let in fresh air. A book moved slightly, as if someone had been reading it. Fresh batteries in a remote control that had been dead for months. One morning in her third week, Rosa discovered something that changed everything. Hidden behind the formal dining room, in a small breakfast nook that was obviously unused, she found evidence of a life that had once been lived rather than simply endured. Children's drawings were taped to the refrigerator, stick figures holding hands, houses with crooked chimneys and smiling suns, the kind of art that parents treasure not for its technical merit, but for the love it represents. School photos showed two children at various ages, a boy with Jonathan's serious eyes and a girl with her mother's gentle smile. Birthday cards signed with careful handwriting. "We love you, Daddy." "Happy Father's Day from your favorite kids." "Thank you for the best Christmas ever." Rosa realized that Jonathan wasn't just a widower. He was a father who had lost not only his wife, but somehow his connection to his own children. The mansion, which had felt empty of life, suddenly revealed itself as a mausoleum preserving not just Sarah's memory, but the ghost of a family that had once filled these rooms with the noise and chaos and beautiful imperfection of actual living. The silence she had attributed to grief took on a different quality. The silence of a man who had forgotten how to be a father because being a husband had been taken from him so completely. This discovery shifted something in Rosa's approach to her work. She began to pay closer attention to the details that spoke of interrupted lives. Children's clothes still hanging in closets, toys carefully stored in bedroom drawers, bicycles in the garage that hadn't been ridden in years. She learned from Mrs. Patterson, in one of the cook's rare moments of gossip, that Jonathan's children lived with his mother-in-law in Marin County, that they visited occasionally but never stayed long, that family dinners had become stilted affairs where everyone pretended not to notice the chair that remained forever empty. The tragedy wasn't just that Sarah had died. It was that her death had somehow convinced Jonathan that he was unfit to be the father his children needed, that his grief was too heavy a burden to share with them, that protecting them meant keeping them away from the house where their mother's absence echoed in every room. Rosa understood this logic because she had lived it herself. After Miguel died, she had sent her own children to live with her sister in Los Angeles, believing that her struggle to survive would somehow contaminate their chances at happiness. It had taken years for her to realize that love shared, even love wounded and imperfect, was better than love withheld in the name of protection. Working in the Ware mansion began to feel less like employment and more like bearing witness to a family's dismantling, watching as money and good intentions conspired to keep people apart, who needed each other desperately. Rosa found herself wondering what Sarah would think of this beautiful, sterile monument to her memory, whether she would have wanted her death to result in such carefully maintained emptiness. The house had everything money could buy. Security systems worth tens of thousands of dollars. Climate control that maintained perfect temperature and humidity. Artwork and furniture that represented investments as much as decor. What it lacked was the one thing that couldn't be purchased or preserved or protected: the messy, imperfect, irreplaceable presence of a family learning how to live together. One evening in early November, as Rosa was finishing her cleaning in the main hallway, she heard something that stopped her in her tracks. Piano music, soft and hesitant, was coming from the direction of the living room. She moved quietly toward the sound and discovered Jonathan sitting at a grand piano that she had assumed was purely decorative. The instrument, a Steinway worth more than most people's houses, had been tuned monthly by a service that charged premium rates for maintaining unused perfection. But now Jonathan was playing, not expertly, but with the careful concentration of someone reaching for a skill long buried under grief and neglect. He was playing Fur-Elise, the notes faltering occasionally as muscle memory competed with emotion. Rosa recognized the piece because her daughter had learned it years ago, practicing on an old upright piano that Rosa had saved months to buy, working extra shifts to afford the lessons that had filled their small apartment with music and hope. As she listened to Jonathan's careful, imperfect playing, she realized he wasn't performing. He was remembering. This was probably something he had played for Sarah, some small intimacy that had been part of their private language before cancer stole their ability to speak it. When the music stopped, Jonathan sat with his hands resting on the keys, his shoulders carrying the weight of 2 years' worth of unshed tears. Rosa stood in the doorway, invisible as always, watching this moment of vulnerability that felt more precious than all the artwork and antiques surrounding them. She understood that she had witnessed something not meant for observation. A glimpse of the man Jonathan had been before loss taught him that love was too dangerous to risk again. The silence that followed the music was different from the mansion's usual emptiness. It was the silence of someone who had just remembered how to breathe. Over the following days, Rosa found herself paying closer attention to Jonathan's patterns, not out of curiosity, but from a growing recognition that his isolation was as carefully constructed as his wealth. He avoided the rooms where family photos were displayed, took his meals in his office rather than the dining room where empty chairs might remind him of what he had lost, and scheduled his days so completely that spontaneity, the natural rhythm of family life, had no space to intrude. His children's scheduled visits were approaching. Rosa learned from Mr. Harrison's passive-aggressive complaints about the additional preparations required, and the entire household was adapting to accommodate guests who were somehow strangers in their own home. The evening before his children's visit, Rosa noticed lights burning late in Jonathan's office. She had stayed past her usual hours to finish preparing the guest bedrooms, not because Mr. Harrison had asked, but because she understood the peculiar anxiety that accompanied family reunions where love had become complicated by loss and time and the fear of saying the wrong thing. As she passed the office door, she saw Jonathan surrounded by wrapped gifts that looked expensive and impersonal, the kind of presents that money could buy, but that said nothing about the person giving them or the people meant to receive them. He sat staring at his selections with the expression of a man who had forgotten how to speak his children's language. Rosa paused in the hallway, remembering the Christmas mornings in her own small apartment when money had been scarce, but love had been abundant. She remembered Miguel staying up late assembling bicycles bought second-hand, painting over scratches to make them look new, wrapping them in newspaper because fancy paper was a luxury they couldn't afford. She remembered her children's faces on those mornings, not disappointed by the makeshift presentation, but delighted by the evidence that someone had thought about them, worked for them, loved them enough to try. The contrast with Jonathan's careful, expensive, emotionally distant gifts struck her as heartbreaking in its own way. The next morning brought an unusual energy to the mansion as staff prepared for the arrival of 13-year-old Marcus and 11-year-old Lily Ware. Mrs. Patterson planned elaborate meals that Rosa suspected the children would find intimidating rather than welcoming. Mr. Harrison reviewed household protocols as if preparing for a diplomatic visit from a foreign country. Even the gardener Maria arranged flowers with extra care, creating displays that were beautiful but somehow sterile, like everything else in the house that had been optimized for appearance rather than comfort. Rosa watched from the kitchen window as Jonathan waited outside for his mother-in-law's car to arrive. He stood with the posture of a man preparing for judgment, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his expression carefully controlled. When Mrs. Elizabeth Morton's Mercedes pulled through the gates, Rosa noticed how slowly Jonathan moved toward it, as if approaching something that might explode if handled incorrectly. The woman who emerged from the passenger side was elegant in the way that comes from inherited wealth rather than earned success, her clothes and jewelry speaking of a lifestyle maintained by trust funds and careful investments. But her face, despite its patrician composure, carried the same weight of loss that Rosa recognized in Jonathan's eyes. The children who tumbled out of the back seat looked like tourists visiting a museum. Marcus, Tall for his age and already showing signs of the serious demeanor that seemed to run in his father's family, shook Jonathan's hand formally rather than accepting the embrace that Jonathan clearly wanted to offer. Lily, smaller and more energetic than her brother, looked around the grounds with the curious but cautious expression of someone entering a space that was technically theirs but didn't feel like home. Rosa watched this reunion from behind kitchen curtains, her heart aching for all three of them, the father who had forgotten how to be comfortable in his children's presence, and the children who had learned to treat their own father like a stranger they were obligated to visit. The weekend that followed was a masterclass in good intentions gone wrong. Every meal was formal, every activity carefully planned, every conversation monitored for signs of the grief that everyone was trying simultaneously to honor and avoid. Jonathan hired professional entertainers, a magician who performed tricks that were technically impressive but somehow cold, a chef who prepared meals that were culinary masterpieces but lacked the warmth of food made with love. He presented his expensive gifts, which the children received politely but without enthusiasm, thanking him with the careful courtesy that children learn when they're afraid of disappointing adults they barely know. Rosa observed these interactions while going about her work, dusting furniture and cleaning rooms, while a family struggled to remember how to be together. She noticed things that the family members themselves seemed to miss, how Marcus's eyes lingered on family photographs that Jonathan had forgotten to put away, how Lily unconsciously hummed a tune that her mother must have sung to her, how Jonathan's hands shook slightly when his daughter asked about the garden that Sarah had loved. They were all performing roles, father, children, family visit, rather than simply being themselves, and the performance was exhausting everyone involved. On Saturday evening, Rosa was organizing the laundry room when she heard unexpected sounds from the kitchen, laughter, the clatter of pots and pans, and voices that sounded more relaxed than any she had heard in the mansion since beginning work there. Curious, despite her intention to remain invisible, she moved quietly toward the sound and discovered Marcus and Lily attempting to make popcorn on the massive commercial-grade stove that Mrs. Patterson rarely allowed anyone else to use. They had clearly snuck downstairs after being tucked into their bedrooms, and they were enjoying the conspiracy of their small rebellion. "I don't think we're supposed to be in here," Lily whispered to her brother, but she was smiling as she said it, the first genuine smile Rosa had seen from either child since their arrival. "Dad won't care," Marcus replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure. "Besides, we used to come downstairs for midnight snacks all the time when—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Rosa understood. When their mother was alive, this kitchen had been a place of comfort rather than a shrine to culinary perfection. The children were trying to reclaim some piece of their old life, some memory of being at home in their own house. Rosa made a decision that violated every protocol Mr. Harrison had established. She stepped into the kitchen, startling both children who immediately looked guilty, as if they had been caught stealing instead of simply trying to make snacks in their own home. "The secret to perfect popcorn," she said gently, "is a little extra butter and a pinch of salt while it's still hot." She moved past them to adjust the heat on the stove, her presence somehow transforming their anxiety into curiosity. "But if you're going to make midnight snacks, we should probably make enough for your father, too. He's probably hungry up there in his office." For a moment, both children stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. The idea that they might include their father in their spontaneous adventure clearly hadn't occurred to them. But Lily, who possessed the open heart that some children managed to maintain, despite being surrounded by adult complications, brightened at the suggestion. "Do you think he would want some?" she asked, and Rosa heard in her voice the hope of a child who still wanted her father to be someone she could share simple pleasures with. "I think," Rosa said carefully, "that your father loves you both very much, but has forgotten how to show it. Sometimes grown-ups need reminding about the important things." She helped them prepare a tray with 3 bowls of popcorn, 3 glasses of milk, and 3 napkins. Equal portions, equal consideration, equal invitation to be part of something together. "Why don't we surprise him?" The journey up the grand staircase felt like a small revolution. Rosa leading the way, Marcus and Lily following with the tray, all three of them conspirators in an act of spontaneous family building. When they reached Jonathan's office, Rosa knocked gently on the door, then stepped aside to let the children enter first. Jonathan looked up from his computer screens with the expression of surprise that crossed his face whenever his carefully structured world encountered something unexpected. "We made popcorn," Lily announced, as if this explained everything. Marcus, more cautious but following his sister's lead, added, "Rosa thought you might be hungry." They set the tray on the small table near his desk, creating an impromptu picnic area in the midst of financial reports and investment portfolios. For a moment, Jonathan seemed uncertain how to respond to this invasion of comfort into his business sanctuary. Rosa watched from the doorway as father and children sat together sharing popcorn, the conversation tentative at first but gradually becoming more natural as the snack provided them with something to do with their hands, something to focus on besides the weight of everything they weren't saying. She slipped away quietly, leaving them to rediscover each other without an audience, but she could hear their voices growing more animated as she walked back toward the kitchen. By some small miracle, they were remembering how to sound like a family. This moment of connection seemed to unlock something in the mansion's carefully controlled atmosphere. Over the remaining day of their visit, Rosa noticed subtle changes in the family dynamics. Jonathan ate breakfast in the dining room instead of his office, joining his children at the table where they could be together instead of consuming food as fuel while conducting business. He asked Marcus about school and actually listened to the answer, his attention focused on his son rather than divided between conversation and stock reports. He played a simple board game with Lily, his competitive instincts giving way to genuine enjoyment of his daughter's laughter. But perhaps most importantly, Rosa observed how the children began to relax in their father's presence, their formal politeness gradually replaced by the natural ease that should exist between parents and children. Marcus made a joke that actually made Jonathan laugh, not the polite acknowledgement of humor that adults sometimes offer children, but genuine laughter that seemed to surprise everyone, including Jonathan himself. Lily fell asleep on the living room couch while watching a movie with her father, curled against his side in the unconscious trust that should be every child's birthright. When the weekend ended and Mrs. Morton arrived to collect Marcus and Lily, the goodbyes looked different than they had on previous visits. Instead of formal handshakes and careful embraces, there were real hugs and promises to call more often. Jonathan stood watching the car disappear through the gates with an expression that Rosa had never seen before. Not the relief of completing a difficult obligation, but the sadness of someone saying goodbye to people he genuinely missed. Something had shifted, some barrier had been breached, and while the change was subtle, it felt significant. In the days that followed, Rosa noticed that Jonathan's routines had altered slightly. He ate meals in the dining room instead of his office, as if maintaining the table setting for a family even when dining alone. He left the living room curtains open, allowing natural light to fill spaces that had been kept dim in deference to his preference for shadows. Most surprisingly, he began playing piano in the evenings, not just the hesitant attempts at Für Elise that Rosa had overheard, but other pieces, songs that filled the mansion with something it had been lacking, the sound of someone choosing beauty over silence. One evening in early December, as Rosa was finishing her work for the day, she encountered Jonathan in the main hallway where he stood looking at a family photograph that had been hanging there, unnoticed by him, for months. The picture showed younger versions of himself, Sarah, Marcus, and Lily at some long-ago Christmas celebration, all of them wearing matching red sweaters and expressions of unguarded happiness. Seeing him study the image, Rosa realized that he was finally able to look at reminders of what he had lost without being overwhelmed by pain. "She was beautiful," Rosa said softly, the first time she had initiated a personal conversation with her employer. Jonathan turned toward her, and instead of the surprise or irritation she expected, his face showed something closer to gratitude. "She was everything," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of 2 years' worth of grief and love. "She made everything make sense. This house, having children, building something together. When she died, I felt like I lost the person who knew how to be happy." Rosa recognized the truth in his words because she had lived her own version of the same loss. "My husband Miguel died 3 years ago in a construction accident," she said, offering her own story not as comparison, but as companionship. "For a long time, I thought happiness had left with him. But then I realized the happiness was never just his to give. It was something we made together, and the making of it, that was something I could learn to do again, differently, but still real." They stood together in the hallway, employer and employee, both understanding what it meant to love someone so completely that their absence felt like losing a limb. But Rosa's words carried the wisdom of someone who had walked through grief and emerged on the other side, still wounded, but also healed in ways that only survivors can be. Jonathan looked at her with something approaching wonder, as if seeing clearly for the first time since Sarah's death that healing was possible, that love could exist in forms beyond the one he had lost. "How do you do it?" he asked, and Rosa understood that he was asking not just about grief, but about the courage required to continue building a life after the foundation had been destroyed. "One day at a time," she said simply, "and you accept help when people offer it, even if it comes from someone you didn't expect." She gestured toward the photograph, toward the evidence of the family that still existed, even though it looked different now. "Your children need you to remember how to be their father, not perfect, just present." That night, Jonathan called his mother-in-law for the first time since the previous visit, not to negotiate schedules or arrange logistics, but to ask about the children's daily lives, to hear stories about Marcus's performance in the school play and Lily's latest art project. He listened with the attention of someone genuinely interested rather than someone fulfilling an obligation, and Mrs. Morton, perhaps hearing something different in his voice, spoke more openly than she had in months about the children's questions about their father, their desire to spend more time with him, their need to feel connected to the parent they still had. The conversation ended with plans for the children to spend Christmas at the mansion, not a brief, formal visit, but an extended stay that would allow them to rediscover their home and their relationship with their father. As Jonathan hung up the phone, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, anticipation for the future rather than mere endurance of the present. Rosa's influence on the household began to manifest in ways both subtle and significant. She convinced Mrs. Patterson to prepare some of the children's favorite meals for their Christmas visit. Not just the elaborate gourmet preparations that looked impressive, but the comfort foods that actually brought pleasure: homemade pizza, chocolate chip cookies, pancakes shaped like animals. She suggested to Mr. Harrison that the formal dining room might be too intimidating for daily family meals, proposing instead that they set up the breakfast nook as a more intimate eating space where conversation could flow naturally. But perhaps most importantly, Rosa helped Jonathan understand that his children didn't need perfect experiences or expensive entertainment. They needed their father to be authentically present, to show interest in their thoughts and feelings, to create space for the ordinary moments that actually constitute family life. She shared stories from her own parenting experience, not as advice, but as examples of how love could be expressed through attention rather than extravagance, through consistency rather than grand gestures. As Christmas approached, the mansion began to feel more alive than it had since Sarah's death. Jonathan worked with Rosa to decorate the house, not with the professional holiday displays that money could buy, but with ornaments and traditions that had personal meaning. They retrieved boxes from storage that contained decorations the children had made in school, stockings that Sarah had embroidered with each family member's name, photo albums that documented Christmas mornings when the family had been whole and happy. Opening those boxes was emotionally difficult for Jonathan, each ornament and photograph a reminder of what had been lost, but Rosa's presence provided him with someone who understood both the pain and the necessity of remembering. She helped him see that honoring Sarah's memory didn't require preserving the house as a shrine to her absence, but rather continuing the traditions and values that had made their family special, adapting them to fit the family that still existed. The week before Christmas, Marcus and Lily arrived for what everyone hoped would be a different kind of visit. Instead of the formal schedule of planned activities that had characterized previous stays, Jonathan had prepared what he called flexible time, hours and days when they could simply be together without agenda or performance. Rosa watched their reunion from the kitchen window, noting how the children seemed more relaxed, how Jonathan's embrace lasted longer and felt more natural, how all three of them looked like they were genuinely happy to see each other. This Christmas visit unfolded with the kind of organic warmth that Rosa remembered from her own family celebrations. There were moments of sadness, certainly. Sarah's absence was felt most keenly during the holidays that had been her favorite time of year. But there were also moments of genuine joy. Marcus teaching his father a card game he had learned at school, Lily insisting that they all participate in a talent show she organized in the living room, Jonathan reading bedtime stories in voices that made his daughter giggle, and his son pretend he was too old for such things while clearly enjoying every moment. Rosa found herself integral to these experiences, not as a servant, but as someone who had become, almost without anyone noticing, part of the family's support system. She knew how Marcus liked his sandwiches cut, and that Lily preferred her milk slightly warmed. She remembered that Jonathan took his coffee black in the morning but enjoyed cream in his afternoon cup. She noticed when someone seemed sad or overwhelmed, and found small ways to offer comfort, a favorite snack, a gentle suggestion for activity, the kind of attention that made each person feel seen and valued. On Christmas Eve, as Rosa was preparing to leave for her own modest celebration at her niece's apartment in the Mission District, Jonathan asked her to stay for dinner. The request surprised her, not just because it violated the careful boundaries that typically existed between employers and domestic workers, but because it represented a recognition that she had become more than just someone who maintained his house. She was someone who had helped him remember how to live in it. "I don't want to intrude on your family time," Rosa said, touched by the invitation, but uncertain about accepting it. "You're not intruding," Jonathan replied, and in his voice she heard something that had been absent for 2 years. Certainty about something that mattered to him. "You've helped us remember how to be a family. We'd like you to be part of that if you're willing." The Christmas Eve dinner that followed was unlike any meal Rosa had ever shared with an employer, but it was also unlike any meal the Ware family had shared since Sarah's death. Instead of formal place settings and stilted conversation, they gathered around the breakfast nook table with mismatched plates and easy laughter. Marcus told stories about his classmates, Lily demonstrated the dance she was learning in after-school classes, and Jonathan shared memories of other Christmas Eves when Sarah had insisted on opening one present early. Always matching pajamas that the entire family would wear while watching holiday movies. As they talked and laughed and shared food that tasted better because it was consumed in the company of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's presence, Rosa realized that she was witnessing something she had helped create. A family learning how to heal together rather than suffer in isolation. Her role in their recovery hadn't been dramatic or obvious. She had simply provided consistent presence, gentle wisdom, and the kind of care that noticed what people needed before they had to ask for it. But healing, Rosa knew from her own experience, is never a straight line. Progress can be interrupted by setbacks, hope can be challenged by fear, and the courage to love again can falter when confronted by reminders of previous loss. The test of the Ware family's recovered bond would come not in the magical atmosphere of Christmas, but in the ordinary days when good intentions had to compete with old habits and new challenges. That test arrived in January when Marcus and Lily returned to their grandmother's house and regular school schedules, and Jonathan returned to the business demands that had consumed his attention for 2 years. The risk was that these positive changes would prove temporary, that the family would slip back into the patterns of careful distance and emotional protection that grief had taught them to maintain. Rosa watched anxiously as Jonathan's calls to the children became less frequent, as his meals moved back to his office, as the piano fell silent again in the evenings. The crisis that would determine whether the Ware family's healing was real or simply a holiday fantasy arrived on a rainy February afternoon when Rosa discovered something that changed everything she thought she knew about her employer and her place in his home. She was cleaning Jonathan's office, organizing papers that had accumulated over weeks of intense focus on a major real estate acquisition, when she uncovered a folder that had been buried beneath quarterly reports and investment statements. The folder contained architectural drawings for a modest house in the Mission District, not a mansion or luxury property, but a simple two-bedroom home with a small garden and a view of the bay. Attached to the drawings were property records showing that Jonathan had purchased this house 6 months earlier, along with correspondence with contractors about renovations and improvements. But most shocking of all was a letter, written in Jonathan's careful handwriting, addressed to Rosa Martinez. The letter explained that Jonathan had noticed Rosa's long commute from the Tenderloin, her obvious exhaustion from working multiple jobs to afford rent in San Francisco's increasingly expensive market, her quiet dignity in the face of financial struggles that his wealth could easily resolve. He had bought the house as a gift, not from pity but from gratitude for the way she had helped his family rediscover itself. The renovations were nearly complete, he wrote, and he had been planning to present her with the deed as a surprise, a way of ensuring that someone who had given so much to others would have security and comfort for herself. Rosa sat in Jonathan's office chair, holding the letter in hands that shook with emotions too complex to name. She had spent her entire adult life working for other people's comfort, while her own remained precarious. She had accepted that security was something other people possessed, that her role was to provide stability for families while never quite achieving it for herself. The idea that someone, especially someone from a world so different from her own, had noticed her struggles and chosen to address them felt almost too extraordinary to believe. But as she studied the architectural drawings, imagining herself in a home she could never lose to eviction or rising rents, Rosa also experienced something unexpected: doubt. Why would Jonathan feel compelled to make such an enormous gesture? What did he expect in return? Was this generosity or manipulation, gratitude or guilt? Her experience with the wealthy had taught her that gifts often came with invisible strings attached, that kindness from employers could be withdrawn as easily as it was granted. When Jonathan returned from his business meeting that afternoon, he found Rosa waiting in his office with the folder spread across his desk. Her expression was unreadable, neither grateful nor angry, but something more complex that made him immediately defensive. He had expected surprise, perhaps tears of happiness, certainly appreciation for his generosity. Instead, Rosa looked at him with the careful assessment of someone trying to solve a problem she hadn't known existed. "Mrs. Martinez," he began, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you do this?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. He had rehearsed explanations about showing appreciation for excellent service, about recognizing her contributions to his family's well-being, about having the means to make a difference in someone's life, and therefore having the obligation to do so. But faced with Rosa's steady gaze, these prepared answers felt inadequate. "Because you saved us," he said finally, the truth emerging without editing or softening. "When you came to work here, my children and I were strangers to each other. I was so buried in grief that I couldn't see past my own pain to notice that they needed their father. You helped me remember how to be present, how to pay attention, how to love them in ways they could actually receive. That's worth more than money can measure." Rosa listened to his explanation, but her expression remained guarded. She had heard similar speeches before from employers who wanted to explain their generosity in terms that made them feel good about themselves. But there was something in Jonathan's voice, a vulnerability that suggested he was telling her the truth rather than telling her what he thought she wanted to hear, that made her consider his words more carefully. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," she said slowly. "But I need you to understand something. I didn't help your family because I wanted anything from you. I did it because they needed help, and I knew how to help them. That's who I am, not what I do for reward." Her words stung because they implied that his gesture was somehow corrupted by assumption, that he had misunderstood her motivations and therefore his response to them. But as Jonathan considered what she was saying, He began to understand that Rosa's concern wasn't about the gift itself, but about what it suggested about his perception of their relationship. "You think I'm trying to buy your friendship?" he said, and it wasn't really a question. "I think you're a good man who's used to solving problems with money," Rosa replied, "but some things can't be purchased. Respect can't be bought. Trust has to be earned. And love, real love, is something you give, because you have it to give, not because you expect something back." They sat in silence for several minutes, the folder of house plans spread between them like evidence in a case they were both trying to understand. Finally, Jonathan spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Keep the house," he said. "Not because of anything you've done for me, but because everyone deserves to have a place they can't lose, a home that belongs to them. If you decide to stay and continue working here, I'll be grateful. If you decide to leave and find another position, I'll understand. The house is yours regardless." Rosa looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the wealthy employer who had the power to change her life with a signature, but the man who had learned to listen to what people actually needed rather than assuming he knew what they should want. This was the person she had glimpsed in quiet moments over the past months, someone whose wealth had never corrupted his ability to recognize genuine human connection when it was offered to him. "I'll think about it," she said, which was neither acceptance nor rejection, but something more honest, acknowledgement that such a significant decision required time and consideration, that gratitude and wisdom didn't always align perfectly. Over the following week, Rosa found herself imagining a different life, one where she could stop worrying about rent increases and eviction notices, where she could invite her own children to visit her in a home she actually owned, where security was something she possessed rather than something she provided for others. The idea was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Financial independence would change not just her circumstances but her identity, transforming her from someone who served others out of necessity to someone who chose her work for its own satisfaction. But as she walked through the Mission District house that Jonathan had purchased for her, seeing the careful attention to details that would make her comfortable, a kitchen with windows facing east to catch morning light, a bathroom with grab bars installed for safety, a small garden space where she could grow the herbs and vegetables she had always wanted but never had room for, Rosa understood that this gift came not from obligation or manipulation but from genuine recognition of her humanity. The decision she made surprised even herself. She chose to accept the house but also to continue working for the Ware family, not because she needed the income for survival, but because she had come to love them in the way that people love each other when they've weathered difficulties together. Her relationship with Jonathan evolved from employer-employee to something closer to family friendship. Two adults who had helped each other heal from impossible losses and who chose to continue sharing their lives because they brought out the best in each other. Marcus and Lily's visits became more frequent and more relaxed as they came to understand that their father's recovery was real and lasting, that the family they had lost when their mother died was being rebuilt in a form that honored her memory while allowing them all to move forward. Rosa became a fixture in their lives, not a replacement for their mother, but a different kind of loving adult whose presence added richness and stability to their world. The mansion that had once felt like a mausoleum gradually transformed into a home that contained both sadness and joy, both memories of what had been lost and hopes for what might still be built. Jonathan learned to cook simple meals for his children's visits, not because Mrs. Patterson was inadequate, but because he wanted to provide care with his own hands. Rosa taught him her recipe for tres leches cake, watching with amusement as this man who managed investment portfolios worth millions struggled to master the timing required for perfect caramel. On the second anniversary of Sarah's death, instead of spending the day in isolated grief as he had the year before, Jonathan invited Marcus, Lily, and Rosa to join him in visiting Sarah's grave. They brought flowers from the mansion's garden, roses that had grown back stronger after their period of neglect, and shared memories that celebrated her life rather than simply mourning her death. Rosa watched the family she had helped heal as they stood together, still sad, but no longer broken, still missing Sarah, but no longer unable to imagine happiness without her. Later that evening, as they sat in the living room where Rosa had first heard Jonathan playing piano, he returned to the bench and began the opening notes of Für Elise. But this time, instead of playing alone, Marcus joined him on the upper keys while Lily hummed along, their voices creating harmony from melody, their presence transforming solitary grief into shared remembrance. Rosa listened from her chair by the window, her heart full with the satisfaction of witnessing love that had learned to include loss without being destroyed by it. Years passed, and the Ware family continued to grow and change in ways that honored both their past and their future. Marcus graduated from high school and chose to attend college in San Francisco, partly so he could remain close to his father and Rosa, who had become family in all the ways that mattered. Lily developed her artistic talents with encouragement from all the adults in her life, creating paintings and sculptures that decorated the mansion with evidence of ongoing creativity and growth. Rosa's own life expanded in ways she had never imagined possible. Secure in her beautiful Mission District home, she was able to bring her own children back to San Francisco, reuniting her family after years of necessary but painful separation. She continued working for the Wares, not from financial desperation, but from choice, taking vacation time to travel to places she had only dreamed of visiting, pursuing interests and friendships that had been impossible when survival consumed all her energy. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in Jonathan himself, who learned that wealth's true value lay not in its ability to insulate him from life's difficulties, but in its power to create opportunities for genuine human connection. He established scholarship funds for working-class students, funded programs that provided job training for domestic workers, and used his business connections to advocate for better working conditions in service industries. His motivation wasn't guilt or obligation, but gratitude, recognition that the person who had saved his family had come from a world he had never bothered to understand, and that understanding that world had made him a better person. On a spring morning, 5 years after Rosa had first walked through the mansion's front doors, she stood in the garden that had once been Sarah's pride, now tended by professional gardeners, but enjoyed by the extended family that had grown around the foundation of loss and healing. Marcus was home from college, teaching his father how to use social media to stay connected with friends and classmates. Lily was experimenting with photography, capturing images of flowers and light that revealed an artist's eye for beauty in ordinary moments. Jonathan approached Rosa as she stood among the roses that had survived neglect and bloomed again with proper care. He no longer looked like the broken man who had hired her out of necessity rather than hope. His face carried lines that spoke of laughter as well as sorrow. His posture reflected confidence that came from knowing he was loved rather than simply needed. "I was thinking," he said, settling beside her on the garden bench that had become their traditional spot for important conversations, "about what you said when I first offered you the house, about how some things can't be purchased." Rosa smiled, remembering that difficult conversation and how much they had all learned since then. "What about it?" "You were right," he admitted. "I couldn't buy your friendship or your family's love, but I could recognize their value when they were offered freely, and I could choose to be worthy of them." He paused, watching his children through the kitchen window as they prepared lunch together, their easy cooperation a testament to the bonds they had rebuilt together. Sarah always said that the measure of a life well lived wasn't what you accumulated, but what you cultivated. I spent 2 years trying to preserve what I had lost, instead of nurturing what I still had. Thank you for helping me remember the difference." Rosa reached over and patted his hand, the gesture carrying 5 years' worth of shared experiences, challenges overcome, and love discovered in unexpected places. "We helped each other," she said simply. "That's what families do." As they sat together in the garden, surrounded by beauty that had grown back stronger after being nearly lost, Rosa reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. She had come to the Ware mansion as a woman who cleaned other people's homes while her own life remained small and precarious. She had found herself part of a family that was learning to love openly again. teacher and student simultaneously, giving and receiving care in the complex dance that occurs when people choose to trust each other with their wounded hearts. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden as the family prepared to gather for lunch, their voices carrying the easy warmth of people who knew they were loved for who they were rather than what they could provide. Rosa stood to join them, understanding that she had found something more valuable than security, more precious than wealth. She had found a place where she belonged, not because she was needed, but because she was chosen, valued, and loved. And you? Have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without ever saying it? Have you been the invisible strength that held someone else's world together while your own remained uncertain? Tell me your story in the comments. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who needs to be reminded that her dignity, her wisdom, and her quiet strength matter more than any paycheck or title ever could. For more stories that honor the unsung heroes who keep our world running with grace and love, click the link in the description. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with us. We'll see you in the next story where ordinary people discover their extraordinary worth.